but participate, make suggestions, things like that. And even as a 6-year-old, I mean, my dad was having to read the lines at the read-through, and I would just kind of sit there at first. My father rants.
There is a particular kind of myth that Hollywood manufactures with extraordinary precision, the myth of the happy set. The idea that somewhere beneath the California sun, brilliant people gather together in a spirit of mutual admiration, laugh between takes, share lunches, and produce art through the sheer warmth of human cooperation. It is a beautiful story. It is also, more often than not, a complete fiction. Ron Howard knows this better than almost anyone alive. Consider what this man has witnessed across 6 decades in the entertainment industry. He arrived on a television soundstage before most children have learned to read. He sat in classrooms built inside studio lots. He took his first professional direction from legends whose names are now carved into the permanent architecture of American culture. And then, when the acting chapters of his story concluded, he stepped behind the camera and spent another 4 decades commanding some of the most talented, most celebrated, and occasionally most volatile human beings that Hollywood has ever produced. Howard has won Academy Awards. He has directed billion-dollar franchises. He has shepherded actors through performances that will be studied in film schools for generations. And through all of it, he has maintained a reputation so thoroughly decent, so reliably warm, so genuinely collaborative that the industry has essentially adopted him as its own beloved mascot of professional integrity. But here is what that comfortable narrative conveniently overlooks: surviving 60 years at the highest levels of Hollywood does not happen through niceness alone. It requires something tougher. It requires the ability to absorb punishment, psychological, professional, and personal, from some of the most difficult, most complicated, and most ferociously self-interested personalities the entertainment world has ever assembled. Ron Howard did not just work alongside greatness. He endured it. He was tested by it. And in many cases, he was genuinely wounded by it. What follows is the story of 6 actors who pushed Ron Howard to his absolute limits, 6 encounters that shaped him, hardened him, and ultimately revealed to him the truth that no film school teaches, that the camera captures beauty, but it is the chaos behind it that builds a director's character. Before Ron Howard understood what acting truly demanded, before he comprehended the politics of a professional set or the complicated machinery of a working performer's psychology, he spent years sitting across from a woman who taught him his first and perhaps most enduring lesson about the distance between image and reality. Frances Bavier was, by any cultural measurement of the early 1960s, America's mother. As Aunt B. Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show, she embodied every domestic virtue the decade celebrated. She was gentle. She was nurturing. She fussed over food and worried about propriety and radiated a kind of unconditional warmth that made living rooms across the country feel slightly safer on Monday evenings. Young Ronnie Howard, cast as Opie Taylor at the age of 6, had every reason to expect that the woman playing his television aunt would extend something resembling that warmth into the reality of their working relationship. What he found instead was one of the most formative shocks of his young professional life. Frances Bavier was not Aunt B. She had never wanted to be Aunt B. She was a rigorously trained stage actress who had spent serious decades in serious theater, a woman who had devoted herself to a craft she considered noble and demanding and worthy of real intellectual engagement. She had not spent those years honing her technique in order to stand in a fictional North Carolina kitchen pretending to bake pies for a sitcom audience. And she made absolutely certain that the people working around her understood the depth of her dissatisfaction. What made Bavier particularly difficult for a child to navigate was the specific texture of her unhappiness. She was not loud. She was not explosive. She did not throw objects or deliver ultimatums or make scenes that a young boy could process as clearly wrong. Instead, she maintained a sustained, elaborately constructed wall of professional coldness that was somehow more disorienting than open hostility would have been. She was present on that set every day, she delivered her lines with technical precision, and she offered the people around her essentially nothing of herself beyond what the script required. Howard has spoken and written about Bavier with a complicated mixture of emotions that speaks to how genuinely confusing she was to work with. On a set built around the performance of familial love, where Andy Griffith and Don Knotts were laughing and improvising and creating the kind of genuine camaraderie that audiences could feel through the screen, Bavier stood apart like a figure from a different world entirely. While the men played and joked, she remained rigid, watchful, deeply unimpressed by the casual atmosphere that everyone else seemed to cherish. There is a revealing detail that Howard has referenced across multiple interviews and in his memoir, co-written with his brother Clint. He observed that Bavier was profoundly offended by the light-hearted energy of the set, that she viewed the informal atmosphere as a kind of insult to the serious business of performance. The high jinks that Griffith and Knotts engaged in, the ad-libbing and the genuine laughter that made the Andy Griffith Show feel so remarkably alive, registered to Bavier not as creative freedom but as professional disrespect. For little Ronnie Howard, the experience of performing intimacy with someone who was privately contemptuous of the entire enterprise was an education no school could have provided. He was being asked, day after day, to look at this woman with the open, trusting eyes of a child and project genuine affection, and she was offering him, in return, the carefully managed blankness of a professional fulfilling an obligation she resented. The lesson, when Howard was finally old enough to understand what he had absorbed, was this: chemistry on screen is frequently an act of pure will, a technical achievement dressed up as emotional truth. The warmth that audiences perceived between Opie and Antby was not a reflection of any warmth that existed between a young boy and his difficult co-star. It was craft. It was performance. It was, in a very real sense, the most honest introduction to the acting profession that Howard could possibly have received. Bavier retired in her later years to North Carolina, the state where Mayberry had always lived in fiction, and she became genuinely reclusive, declining reunions, withdrawing from public life, eventually leaving the bulk of her estate to animal welfare. She was a woman who spent decades in a career that never gave her the identity she had worked for, and whose most famous role was the one she wished most fervently she had never accepted. Howard has never spoken of her with cruelty. He speaks of her with the particular compassion that comes from genuinely understanding someone's pain, even when that pain was directed at you. She taught him that a set is not a family. It is a collection of individual human beings, each carrying private burdens, each performing their own invisible drama alongside the visible one. Understanding that truth, early and completely, made Howard a fundamentally more empathetic director. If Frances Bavier represented the interior variety of Hollywood difficulty, the cold, turned-inward resentment of someone fighting a private war, then Yul Brynner was its absolute opposite. Brynner's difficulty was entirely exterior. It was a performance in itself, a carefully constructed and relentlessly maintained projection of absolute authority that filled every room he entered and left very little oxygen for anyone else. Ron Howard met Brynner in 1959, during the filming of The Journey, a Cold War drama directed by Anatole Litvak. Howard was 5 years old. Brynner was at the precise apex of his cultural power, a man who had won the Academy Award for The King and I just 3 years earlier and who carried himself with a conviction that the Oscar had merely confirmed what he had always privately known, that he was, in some essential way, above ordinary consideration. The shaved head. The extraordinary cheekbones. The voice that seemed to emerge from some architectural depth rather than a human throat. Everything about Brynner's physical presence was calibrated to communicate dominance, and the calculation worked with devastating effectiveness. Howard, a small, red-headed child accustomed to the gentle, genuinely warm professional atmosphere that his father Rance Howard created around him, found himself in the presence of something he lacked any framework to process. Brynner did not acknowledge children as participants in a shared professional environment. This was not, precisely, a decision he made about young Ronnie Howard specifically. It was simply how Brynner moved through the world. He occupied space differently than other people, more completely, more deliberately, with a kind of territorial authority that left everyone around him in the position of guest rather than colleague. Crew members who had worked on dozens of productions, seasoned professionals who had seen every variety of Hollywood temperament, visibly reorganized their behavior in his presence. Howard witnessed something on that set that would stay with him for decades. He watched what fear does to a creative environment. He watched talented, experienced people become careful and tentative and small because the largest presence in the room had established, through nothing more than manner and implication, that mistakes would be received as personal affronts. The energy that should have been going into creative problem-solving was being redirected entirely into the exhausting business of not displeasing Yul Brynner. This is a dynamic that Howard would encounter again in various forms throughout his career, but Brynner's version of it was uniquely pure because it was the original. It was the template. The Hollywood studio system of the 1950s had, in many ways, created Brynner, had built the infrastructure of deference and protection and careful management that allowed a star of his magnitude to move through the industry without ever being meaningfully challenged. He was a product of a system that treated certain actors as sovereign, and he had accepted that treatment so completely that the performance of royalty had simply become who he was. The philosophical collision between what Howard witnessed on that set and what he would later build as a director is almost too complete to be coincidental. Howard's sets are consistently described by the people who work on them as unusually relaxed, unusually egalitarian, characterized by a genuine openness to contribution from every level of the production. Actors and crew members regularly report that working with Howard feels different, safer, more collaborative, more genuinely creative, than working with most directors in his position. That culture was not an accident. It was, at least in part, a deliberate construction built in direct reaction to an experience a 5-year-old boy had on a European film set in 1959, watching adults make themselves smaller in deference to a man who had made his own largeness the central project of his life. Howard decided, at some level too fundamental to be fully conscious, that he would not run rooms that way. He would be powerful enough to lead without ever requiring that the people around him feel afraid. Brynner died in 1985, his final public act a series of recorded anti-smoking advertisements made while he was dying of lung cancer, a final performance of remarkable and characteristic boldness. Whatever his personal difficulties, the man understood how to make an impression. And the impression he made on Ron Howard, at 5 years old on the set of The Journey, turned out to be one of the most instructive of Howard's professional life. By 1982, Ron Howard had made the transition from actor to director with the kind of careful intentionality that characterized everything he did. Night Shift, a comedy starring Henry Winkler, Michael Keaton, and Shelley Long, was his opportunity to demonstrate that he could command a major studio production, that the easy warmth and instinctive narrative intelligence he had spent his childhood absorbing could be translated into directorial authority. The film gave him Shelley Long, and Shelley Long gave him a category of difficulty he had not previously encountered and was not entirely prepared for. Long was extraordinarily talented. This fact is not incidental to the story, it is central to it. A director struggles to dismiss the demands of a mediocre performer. The demands of a genuinely brilliant one are another matter entirely, because they arrive wrapped in an inconvenient legitimacy that makes them much harder to refuse. Long came from the intellectual tradition of Chicago's improvisational theater world, a training ground that emphasizes analysis, deconstruction, and the rigorous interrogation of every choice a performer makes. She did not approach a script as a series of lines to be delivered with appropriate feeling. She approached it as a problem to be solved, a system to be understood from the inside out, a structure whose every element needed to be justified before she could commit to executing it. This is, in the abstract, an admirable approach to acting. In practice, on a film set operating under a studio schedule with a finite number of shooting days, it created a friction that Howard has described with remarkable restraint considering how genuinely destabilizing it must have been. While Michael Keaton, loose, instinctive, electrically gifted, was essentially creating material on the spot, and while Henry Winkler was bringing the generosity and warmth that had always defined his best work, Long was frequently the point at which the machine stalled. Not because she was careless or arrogant in any simple sense, but because her commitment to understanding every dimension of her character's psychology translated, on a practical level, into extended conversations about motivation and intention and textual logic that ate into shooting time with a thoroughness that challenged Howard's composure. Howard was learning something specific and important about the difference between difficulty born of ego and difficulty born of genuine intellectual engagement. Both varieties cost you time and money and emotional energy. But they require completely different responses from a director. The ego-driven difficult actor needs to be managed, needs their sense of significance acknowledged before they can relax into the work. The intellectually driven difficult actor needs to be argued with, needs to encounter a directorial mind equally committed to the truth of the material, because they will not be satisfied by flattery or diplomacy alone. Howard was, at this point in his career, more naturally inclined toward the diplomatic solution. He was young, he was working to establish his authority, and his entire instinct was to find the path of least resistance through conflict. Long did not allow that path to exist. She pressed on questions that required genuine answers, and Howard had to find within himself the confidence to either give those answers or to hold his ground and move the scene forward on the strength of his own conviction. The film got made. Long is genuinely remarkable in it. She brings a vulnerability and specificity to the character of Belinda that elevates material that could easily have been disposable. The difficulty produced something real, and Howard was honest enough to acknowledge this even while the process was grinding him down. But the broader lesson was about the nature of leadership itself. Howard realized that being well-liked, which came naturally to him, was a fundamentally different skill set from being trusted, which had to be earned specifically and continually. Long would not trust him simply because he was pleasant. She needed to believe that he understood the material as well as she did, that his authority was based on genuine mastery rather than the institutional arrangement that had made him the director and her the actor. That realization, that warmth and authority are separate instruments that must be played simultaneously, became one of the load-bearing columns of Howard's directorial identity. There are actors who are difficult in ways that gradually reveal themselves to be counterproductive. And then there is Russell Crowe, who is difficult in ways that gradually reveal themselves to be the precise mechanism through which certain kinds of greatness become possible. When Howard cast Crowe in A Beautiful Mind in 2001, he was not unaware of what he was acquiring alongside the extraordinary talent. Crowe's reputation for intensity, confrontation, and an absolute refusal to prioritize the comfort of the people around him over the demands of his own creative process was not a secret. Howard chose him anyway, because the role of John Nash, a man whose mind was simultaneously his greatest gift and his most devastating torment, required exactly the kind of uncompromising, all-consuming investment that Crowe was constitutionally incapable of offering in any other form. What followed was, by Howard's own account, one of the most demanding collaborative experiences of his professional life. Crowe did not merely play John Nash. He occupied him, built a sustained psychological inhabitation of the character that required the entire production to organize itself around the needs of that occupation. This is a significant demand to make of a film set, which is by nature a collaborative machine with hundreds of moving parts, none of which exists exclusively in service of a single performer's process. The friction took several forms. There were extended debates about single lines of dialogue, conversations about the precise weight and intention of individual words that stretched into hours and left the schedule in a difficult position. There were disagreements about blocking, about camera placement, about the fundamental approach to specific scenes, in which Crowe would arrive with a firmly established vision of how the moment needed to work and Howard would have to meet that vision with one of his own, because Crowe had no interest in directors who hadn't done the same rigorous preparation he had. The most logistically significant example was Crowe's insistence on shooting the film in chronological order. For any production, this is an expensive and complicated request. The standard practice of film shooting, organizing scenes by location, by the availability of sets and actors, by 100 practical considerations that have nothing to do with narrative sequence, exists for genuine reasons. Howard's initial resistance was entirely reasonable. But Crowe's argument was not unreasonable. He contended that the psychological deterioration of John Nash could not be convincingly rendered if he was required to jump between mental states according to a schedule built around logistical convenience. That the truth of the performance required the performer to live through the experience in the order in which the character had lived it. Howard listened. He considered the argument seriously. And in a decision that speaks to his own intellectual honesty, he recognized that Crowe was not being obstinate for obstinacy's sake. He was being demanding in service of a genuine truth about the performance. He pivoted. They shot chronologically. The film won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and Crowe received an Academy Award nomination for a performance widely considered among the finest of his generation. Howard has spoken about this collaboration with a particular kind of hard-won respect, the respect of someone who was genuinely tested and found, in the testing, something valuable about his own capacity. Managing Crowe required Howard to be more specific, more prepared, more intellectually committed than the pleasant collaborative atmosphere of his other sets typically demanded. Crowe did not want a nice director. He wanted an equal. And Howard, who had spent his entire career being everyone's congenial colleague, had to reach for something harder and more demanding within himself. They worked together again on Cinderella Man and maintained a genuine friendship through it all, a friendship built not on comfort but on the mutual recognition of two people who had pressed against each other and found, in the resistance, something authentic. Every variety of Hollywood difficulty discussed to this point has involved, at its core, an excess of something, an excess of pride, of intimidation, of analytical rigor, of creative intensity. Tom Sizemore represented something more painful and more complicated, a story not of excess but of disappearance. In the mid to late 1990s, Sizemore was among the most compelling supporting actors working in American cinema. His presence in films like Heat, Saving Private Ryan, and Black Hawk Down demonstrated a raw, physical authenticity that was genuinely rare,